Guys, welcome back to another episode of this podcast, still yet to be named. Hey, maybe that's the name of this podcast. Who knows? In this episode, we are going to be talking about college football and college basketball. From the college football side of it, we are going to be looking at how college prospects are doing going into the NFL draft. How'd they do at the Reese's Senior Bowl? How'd they do at the Shrine Bowl? And is the Shrine Bowl trying to take over as the top game compared to the Reese's Senior Bowl? Stay tuned to find out. We're also going to be talking about some Brian Hardison news and what is going on at Auburn. And then we might get to what happened on National Signing Day and Jimbo Fisher's press conference and his new mortal enemy, sliced bread. So stay tuned to find out for that. In the college basketball side, we're going to be talking about which teams are still in play to win the regular season conference championships for each of the Power Six conferences, and who might lock down one seeds or who might lock down buys going into their conference tournaments. God, we're like a month away from that, aren't we, Andrew?
Yeah, 5 weeks from yesterday, we're going to have a bracket for the NCAA tournament.
This college basketball season is flying by. Welcome back, guys. Thank you, Andrew, for joining me. Let's get into this. So a little right before we started recording this podcast, news broke from Bleacher Report that scouts aren't really high on this draft class as top-end talent. Scouts told Albert Breer, a couple of veteran NFL evaluators told me late in the week that they don't believe there's a single NFL starter in this year's quarterback class. Not everyone was that harsh, but it was unanimous that these quarterbacks aren't close to last year's, and most agreed that all 5 of last year's first-round signal callers would have been the top guys at the position in the 2022 NFL draft. We saw 5 quarterbacks taken in the first round last year. There are 2 to 3 guys that are being talked about as possible first-round picks this year. The guy who impressed the most during the Senior Bowl, Kenny Pickett, showed the most consistency out of all the quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl, but really wasn't all that super impressive during the practices. Malik Willis is viewed as having the highest ceiling of all these guys. He needs to end up in the right situation. He's the most athletic and most impressive, but he played at Liberty and Auburn, and both those offenses weren't really NFL offenses. When it comes to the running back position, Tyler Beatty impressed as a pass catcher, but Dameon Pierce, the Florida running back, impressed across the board. Whether that was pass blocking, receiving, or running the ball, he was the most impressive of all those at the position across the board. When it comes to guys, FCS guys that really impressed, I want to look at the offensive line. Trevor Penning from Northern Iowa showed a nasty temperament and impressed scouts. He didn't play against the best competition playing at Northern Iowa, but he does have the potential to be a great offensive lineman in the NFL. And then the story across the board all weekend and all week, I should say, was the Senior Bowl defensive lineman, all impressed. And it was hard to choose one guy that impressed the most. So we're just going to cover that as the whole defensive line of just being guys that could be different makers at the next level. And then keep an eye out for a video on this prospect, Montana State's Troy Anderson. There were a lot of questions on whether he deserved to be at the Senior Bowl and whether he was going to bring talent to the next level. Man, he proved he belonged and impressed a lot of scouts at the Senior Bowl. Moving over to the Shrine Bowl, I was reading a story on The Athletic earlier today about how the Shrine Bowl is looking to overtake the Senior Bowl, Reese's Senior Bowl. And the Reese's Senior Bowl doesn't really see them as a competition. They still see them as a lower level bowl game. I think the number was 85% of the players who played at the Reese's Senior Bowl last year ended up going on to be drafted. And the Shrine Bowl's numbers are nowhere near close to that. They tried to recruit Malik Willis to come play in the Shrine Bowl, and it looked like Willis was going to go to the Shrine Bowl until he flipped his commitment to the Senior Bowl. We're seeing the question coming out is, are we going to see recruitment for these guys to go to these bowl games like we see with the Under Armour All-American Bowl and the All-American Game played for the high school players each year? They scheduled their game this year in the Vegas area to be around the Pro Bowl game. They let players meet with NFL players at the Pro Bowl and just focused on players' health throughout the whole weekend. But the one downside of this is it cut out opportunities of players impressing at these Senior Bowls or these showcase bowls of doing so well in the Shrine Bowl, they earn an invite to the Reese Senior Bowl to then get even more exposure. And NFL staffs aren't loving the idea of both these bowl games being played at the same time because it caused them to really spread out their scouting department. And then the biggest issue at the Shrine Bowl is their quarterback play. They just have not had a big name quarterback. But speaking of risers, there was one quarterback at the Shrine Bowl that did raise his draft stock, and that was Brown quarterback E.J. Perry. He showed he had better arm strength than many thought. Perry originally started at Boston College before transferring to Brown. I believe he broke a bunch of records at Brown, and he was named the offensive MVP at the Shrine Bowl. Originally, it looked like Ty Chandler, the running back out of North Carolina, was going to be on track to win the MVP until Perry had late game heroics. And Chandler also raised his draft stock over this past weekend and showed good combination of power, speed, and agility. And then the last guy I want to talk about is a guy not a lot of people have really heard of before, and that's Deontay Knight from Western Ontario. Yes, you heard that right. Western Ontario. He's a Canadian football player. Knight struggled throughout his first day at the Shrine Bowl practices, but it wasn't long before he was a persistent threat to getting to the quarterback. He also did a good job holding up in the run game, though that took even longer to acclimate. Knight is not going to be one of the biggest names in this year's draft class, but he could be a guy who's a late round draft pick and could be a fun name to watch coming out of Canada. Guys who crushed their draft stock. De'Aaron King, former Miami quarterback, dealt with a minor injury, so he couldn't actually play in the actual Shrine game. He was playing both quarterback and wide receiver, and he just looked out of place at wide receiver, scouts were saying. And when he was playing quarterback, he checked down too much and just was inaccurate with the ball. Staying there, we're going to stay with the quarterbacks. Ty Thompson from Kansas State. Thompson had a poor game and a worse week. His timing within the offense was off, and he often made the wrong reads when he sailed the ball over the heads of his intended targets into the sidelines. He had a lot of doubters going into this weekend, and he may have in the process created more, and he's going to have a large uphill battle to go. Andrew, what are your thoughts on any of these Senior Bowl or Shrine Bowl guys?
You know, I haven't really seen too much of them just because I'm not as in depth with the college football world. Just in general, you know, you gotta hope that each guy can find their true home in the NFL. I'm certain every time that talent is said to be really good, there's a few extra disappointments than what we expected and busts. And anytime talent is said to be really bad, there's some really bright spots that nobody would have foresaw. So I think at the end of the day, it will average itself out. And, you know, there will be players who find forever homes in the NFL.
I think one of the more interesting things people are talking about, although they're not as high on this year's NFL draft class, this has the potential to be a class where 10 years down the line, we look at this and say, how did we miss on these guys? Why were these guys graded so badly? Because they end up having long NFL careers. And a lot of that has to do with there being no true, wow, that's a first overall guy. We need to grab him. It allows for these quarterbacks to end up in situations where they maybe have time to develop and land in situations that are best for them, and they're not thrown into the fire right away. I mean, Kenny Pickett's being projected to the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it's going to be a fun thing to watch. But moving from college football into the NFL draft, we're going to be going into college football. And is Brian Harson's job security in trouble? Now, this was a hiring that a lot of people looked back on and said, why Brian Harson's a guy from Idaho who coached at Boise State is now moving down to one of the more storied SEC programs in the nation. It kind of was a hiring that was out of left field when I heard about it last year. There have been a few rumors over the past week of players coming out and saying stuff, things off the field stuff that have happened. I'm not even going to address them because they're rumors, and there's no reason to talk about rumors in this situation. But the relationship has been rocky with the university, and it's one of those things where, as I was researching this more, Brian Harson's might have been set up to fail before he even got to Auburn. When Auburn was doing their search, there was half the leaders of the university that wanted to do a nationwide search, and that Harsin's was their guy for after that search, and half the people who wanted to promote from within. Defensive coordinator Chris Steele was viewed as a possible candidate for that job. And when you have that sort of split at a university like Auburn on who's going to be your coach, that is setting up a coach to fail before he even gets there. Along with that, Harsin's has not recruited to the level that many expect Auburn to recruit at. Even under Malzahn, I think the statistic was 6 out of the 8 recruiting classes he had, or 8 out of the 10, were within the top 10, and those other 2 were like 11 and 12th ranking. And Harsin's was nowhere. I think Harsin's recruiting class this past year was in the 20s. Their highest rated recruit was the 141st best player in the nation, and that's not going to cut it when you're coaching at Auburn, especially when you look at the teams Auburn has to play every year. Georgia, Alabama, and Texas A&M finished top 3 in the nation, not in that order. And those are teams Auburn's playing every single year. They have to play Alabama in their rivalry game. Their cross-division set rivalry game is Georgia. They have Texas A&M, like I mentioned, and you have LSU with Brian Kelly impressing through the transfer portal and on the recruiting trail as well. And if you want to succeed at Auburn, you have to be recruiting to that same level. Now, Auburn is a school that is viewed as national championship contenders if you get that talent in, and they did make it to the national championship game a little over a decade ago, and they won the 2010 national championship game and also made it in the 90s as well, and had an undefeated season in 2004. They've had success, and they've had recent success. 6-7 is not going to cut it for a fan base. One of the issues, though, is when you look at it, Josh Pate, one of my favorite podcasts I listen to every week in and week out, is Late Kick, had posed a great question to his audience. You look at Alabama, you know who's running the program. I ask you, Andrew, who's running the Alabama program?
That would be Nick Saban.
Exactly. You look at Georgia, who's running Georgia's program?
Kirby Smart.
Now, you look at Auburn's program, and although you have head coach Brian Harsin's there, you can't say Brian Harsin's is running this program. Yes, he's only been there for a year, but he's not the guy you think of running the program. And there's really no one you could think of who's running the program. And I think Josh made a great point talking about that on Sunday's episode. You have, I think, a new athletic director coming in who did not hire Harsin's. You have a huge recruiting class this year. Alabama has a large amount of top 37 prospects as we sit today coming out, and you need to land a handful of talent. That's why a lot of people don't think Harsin's is going to survive the summer, because Auburn's going to want a coach that connects with these players. And this relationship soured. It's going to get to the point where the boosters pay all this money to be a part of it. It's one of the best parts of Auburn, but one of the worst parts, because they want a part of the decision on who's going to be the next head coach. And Harsin's was not the guy they wanted. And it's just a mess. I mean, as a coach, why would you leave a secure job to go coach a program that's in such disarray? They paid $20 million to buy out Gus Malzahn's contract because Malzahn was not doing his job, in their opinions. They're going to pay $18 million to buy out Harsin's contract if they can't fire him without cause. And it's just something where you're a coach and you're like, oh, I got this huge buyout. They'll give me time. Well, you might not have that time to rebuild a program like Auburn. They are at a turning point. If they stick with Harsin needs to recruit better. He's got to get the program back in his hands. And the players seem to love him from the players that are still on the roster. But you've seen 20 players leaving the transfer portal, and you've seen 5 coaches, including 2 offensive coordinators and his defensive coordinator in the past few weeks, leave or get fired. Auburn football is just in a very interesting situation and is kind of in a mess situation. And by the time this comes out, Harsons may not be the head coach of Auburn. And these might be the reasons why he's no longer the coach at Auburn. So on National Signing Day was Wednesday. And I've released a lot of videos on commits that ended up committing to Texas A&M. And the comment section was full of, wow, I wonder how much money they gave him, or wow, he flipped to Texas A&M over Miami or LSU because they offered him more money and all this stuff. And there was a report that came out on a message board by a guy by the name of Slice Bread talking about how Texas A&M's boosters put together a fund of over $30 million to give out to recruits in this class to bring that talent in. And it left a lot of people angry. And it kind of was a slight loophole in NIL and a bunch of other stuff. And I know this is kind of a controversial topic to talk about, but I don't get, how am I going to word this? I was going to release a video on this last week. I got a script written out and everything, and just I didn't feel right. Didn't feel like I should release it. But I don't get why people are so angry about this. Texas A&M is not the only school doing this. Schools across the nation, not just in the SEC. I mean, Texas has their own fund. You got to think the Alabama boosters have their own sets of deals and are just not as vocal, or it's not in the public. And there's different laws in different states of what you can and can't do with high school recruits. And I think Texas A&M kind of just took advantage of what was going on. Is it wrong? That's debatable. I mean, these guys have this platform and aren't always coming from the greatest situations. So when you have the opportunity to make this amount of money as a player at a young age, life-changing money for some of these guys to help your family, can you blame them for taking those deals? Can you blame players for doing what's best for their families, whether that's getting on the field immediately or not? It's hard to judge when you're not going through the situation yourself. Where it gets a little dirty is, should this be where college football is? Should you be allowed to use the money recruiting wise? You're not really supposed to. And, you know, here's a clip of what Jimbo Fisher had to say on the situation. I'll send you the clip with the audio and everything to put in. He took offense of people asking about it, and that's all I could say is it's hard whether it's right or not. It's hard whether this should be the game or not between the transfer portal and NIL. I think players should be able to make money off the name, image, and likeness. I think things have just gotten so complicated with that. Do you have an opinion on this?
I do. I don't know if I've expressed it on this platform, but I know I've expressed my opinion before that I disagree that college players should be paid to play. That's not NIL, but they should not be paid to play. And what this sounds like is Texas A&M is paying these guys to come to their school. To me, that's wrong. I would never blame a player for seeing a check and saying no to it. I'm not going to blame a kid for that. The only judgment here would be towards the Texas A&M program. And quite frankly, if the NCAA isn't going to do anything about it, I don't see why they wouldn't do this. The NCAA is very flip-floppy on when they want to enforce their rules or not. And that's where we get major issues. You know, there are times where it's tiny infractions that they absolutely rain down and ban a team from the postseason. And then there's times like this where it feels like a very clear violation of the rules, and they just kind of turn a blind eye. So personally, what I think needs to happen in the sport is they need to revisit the NIL rule, make more definitive, like guidelines on what is NIL, what isn't NIL. And at the end of the day, I'm not an expert, so maybe that means I'm a whiner, but they need to revisit those rules, and then they need to start looking closer at these organizations and at these teams and colleges to see who's infracting against these and start raining down on them harder to make it more even. I understand that that's not how this sport and how college football is moving, but at the end of the day, I don't agree with pay to play, and I think that's the only thing to do about it. The counter argument to me is it will happen one way or another, and I understand that, and from that standpoint, that's why I'm not truly getting on a soapbox and preaching to the world how awful this is. But I also think that's a really, really bad excuse. That to me just sounds like, oh, well, the NCAA doesn't care. And that shouldn't be what it comes down to. But unfortunately, that is what it is.
I mean, from the image the NCAA has put out over, gosh, as long as I've been alive, it started off as a great organization for amateurism and help athletes. But once all this TV money and everything went in, it kind of stopped doing that. And you know what? Like I feel like the situation where we are in college football, and it's not talked about as much in college basketball. You got to think it's happening in all these money-making sports. Men's college basketball and college football are the two main money-making sports. You can't blame a player. You can't say, oh, you shouldn't take that. Because if any of us were offered $750,000 to go play football at a school we want to play football at.
If I was offered $20 to go play football in front of the Kohl Center right now, I would.
And use your platform to help your family or set yourself up for whatever you can. Because you are also one injury away from having that NFL dream taken away from you. And we've seen it happen over and over again for players. So don't get angry at the players for doing it. And don't judge players for, someone commented on one of my videos, oh, his family, he was going to commit to this school, but ended up pulling it back and got more money from another school after negotiating. Can you blame him? If you were in this situation, whether it's right or not, would you not do that yourself? I mean, help your family out. You only go through this process once, and it's not as huge unless you're a all-star athlete like Caleb Williams or Quinn Ewers to get something like this again. And NIL is complicated. I don't think there's a set leadership that could really help it out. And I think this is kind of what we're going to have to get used to for now. Unless you put a cap on it. I mean, but at the same time, how is that fair? If you cap players' NIL money, you got to cap coaches' salaries. And that's where I get a little annoyed with this, is when coaches that are making $8 to $12 million a year start saying, well, I don't think this is right. But that's just the nature of college football. So Auburn football is in a bad place, but is Auburn basketball in such a bad situation in their SEC race over in college basketball?
Not even slightly. They have the biggest lead out of any Power 6 conference, with a 2-game lead over next Kentucky. Auburn is sitting in a really good spot. So just before we get into the SEC, the way that we determined who would be mentioned in this video is from analyst Fran Fraschiller's model for who can win the conference, which basically means you take however many games you're behind by and you double that, and that's the amount of games you have to have left. So for Kentucky, they're behind by 2. If they have 4 or more games left, they can win the conference. While there are teams that won't be mentioned on here that, yes, statistically they still can win, I'm not going to include them just for that purpose. But going into the SEC, the guys who are left are Auburn. They have a +2 lead. Then we have Kentucky, 2 games behind. Arkansas and Tennessee are both 3 games behind, and Mississippi State 4.5 games behind. This is the shortest list out of any conference for how many teams are still in it. And when you look at the schedules that they have left, Auburn has one of the easier schedules left. Their hardest game really being at Arkansas or Tennessee, take your pick. So I think that they're truly going to run away with this in the SEC. Because the SEC has 14 teams, they have 4 teams that get a second round bye. And I think it's worth thinking about who that might be. And just looking at those 4 teams, who's left, who they all have left in their schedules, I think it really does favor Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi State to actually overtake Tennessee, because the only hard teams Mississippi State has left is they play Tennessee at home, at LSU, at Alabama, and against Auburn. Everybody else is completely out of the NCAA tournament picture and really the conference picture. So as long as Mississippi State can take care of business, I think those are the 4 teams that we'll be seeing get second round byes for the SEC. What do you think about this, Johnny?
I think Auburn is one of the more interesting case studies to look at this year. I mean, they are one of the best teams in the nation, but almost lost to Georgia this past weekend, which was kind of surprising. I kind of agree with you that Auburn, Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi State are the 4 teams that get the first round bye. But I also kind of hope Tennessee gets it over Mississippi State just because of the people I've met in my life who are Tennessee fans. Guys, I remember you down at Neyland earlier this year. So I'm hoping for their sake, Tennessee pulls it off and gets that first round bye. That's all chalk then. So get a little excitement down the run. What's the next conference you want to talk about, Andrew?
I think that we'll save some of the other more exciting conferences for last. So we'll just go into the Pac-12 just to begin. The teams that are still left here are Arizona, who has a 1.5 game lead, Oregon and UCLA, which are both behind by 1.5 games, Washington State, which is behind by 2, USC, which is only behind by 1.5 technically, but has a lot of games that they haven't played this year due to COVID protocols, which actually puts them below Washington State. Washington, which has behind by 2.5 games, and Stanford, which is behind by 3. So to me here, Washington State has looked good, but they have a very packed schedule with a bunch of good teams. I would make the argument for one of the hardest schedules out of the teams left. Washington and Stanford just aren't that good of teams, in my opinion. They've hung on in a bad Pac-12, which maybe is a little bit, gutsy for me to say, considering we all thought last year was a bad Pac-12 and look what they did in the NCAA tournament. But I just don't really see those two even cracking a chance. USC has opportunities, but I don't foresee them really capitalizing, especially after getting swept by a team like Stanford. So that boils down to Arizona, Oregon, and UCLA. Arizona has already finished all of their battles with the UC schools. So it's kind of down to them and Oregon battling it out. And I think that they'll overtake Oregon. And I think that they have the best shot to win it all. Arizona, that is.
I agree with you. I think Arizona is in the best situation. I believe those are the remaining games are Oregon, Washington State, Washington, and Stanford.
Those are the only remaining games that are worth mentioning. Like we might have a game against like California or Colorado or Utah or something like that.
The only concern I would say is the fact that the Washington game is on the road and the way college basketball arenas can get sometimes. Yeah, but I mean, with the 1.5 lead and games worth mentioning with the schedule remaining, it's just you got Oregon at home, you got Stanford at home. Those are 2 of the teams you just mentioned. I don't see how a game and a half is a kind of a big lead at this point of the season.
Yeah. So moving on from the Pac-12 to the Big 12, a conference that a lot of people expected a lot of parity in this year, and I might actually add to that. Ironically, there are only 5 teams left to talk about in the Big 12 based off of our model. Kansas, who has a 1.5 game lead, Texas Tech and Baylor, who both have or who are both behind by a game and a half, Texas, who is behind by 2.5 games, and TCU, the surprise of the conference, behind by 3.5. But ultimately, my favorite to win this conference is actually Texas Tech. They've already played both of their games against Kansas, splitting them and losing to Kansas in overtime in Lawrence. Their only remaining games are 2 against Oklahoma, 2 against TCU. They play Baylor in, not Waco, in Lubbock, and they play at Texas. While no game is ever guaranteed in the Big 12, this feels like the easiest schedule you could physically have, and only being a game and a half back from Kansas, I think Kansas could easily drop 1 or 2 of the Texas games or the game at Baylor, even though they did just smoke them in Lawrence. And they always seem to struggle when they go into Morgantown. So I really do like Texas Tech to win this conference.
I want to go with Baylor, but when you look at some of the games they have left, it's just on the road at Texas Tech, on the road at Texas. You got Kansas at home, but depends on how your team's going, coming off the stretch of against Texas and then at Texas Tech and then home against TCU. It's one of those teams where Baylor, you want to go with the gut feeling, but it's just with what they have in front of them is just a tough road to go down. I lean towards Texas Tech or Kansas as my choice for the Big 12.
Absolutely. Now, I want to talk about one of the more interesting conferences, the Big East. This is a year where we haven't seen Villanova being the clear-cut number 1 guy. They're not even leading right now. Currently leading the Big East is Providence with a 1-game lead over Villanova. Still left in the mix beyond Villanova with that 1-game deficit is Marquette, who is behind by 2.5 games, UConn, who's behind by 3.5 games, Xavier behind by 4, and Creighton behind by 4.5. All of these teams are very capable teams. There are teams that are knocked out of it, like Seton Hall, that are also capable. But I think that we very realistically could see a 3-way tie atop. This is the conference. If any of them are going to have a tie, I believe this would be the one. Marquette has by and far the easiest schedule out of any of the 6 teams I just named. They only really play at UConn and at Creighton. They have other games, obviously, but those are the 2 biggest games they have left this year. They already went through Villanova and Xavier multiple times. They already went through Providence. So if Marquette can take care of business, I don't see them losing too many of those other games. Villanova and Providence both play each other twice still. Well, obviously, they play each other twice still. So I could see them splitting that series and kind of going even to make it that there is that 3-way tie between Providence, Villanova, and Marquette at the top. Just while I'm saying that, UConn and Xavier are extremely talented teams, and Creighton can have it on any given night. So it's impossible to say what ties are going to happen in this conference, but that's what I think is going to happen.
I want to go with UConn just because Pop Warner with Dan Hurley's son back in the day. So I'm putting my marbles in all of UConn, so I'm going with that. I'm probably going to be wrong in the end, though.
Now let's talk about the ACC. The ACC has the most teams that are still in it, ironically, considering everybody looks to Duke as the only team really in the conference. Duke has a half of a game lead over Notre Dame. Notre Dame behind by a half game, obviously then. Wake Forest is behind by 1, Miami behind by 1.5, North Carolina behind by 1.5, Virginia's trailing by 2, Florida State by 3.5, and Syracuse by 3.5. Ultimately, though, I do think there is a clear-cut, difference in where these conferences fall. or where are the great teams of this conference? Where are the good teams of this conference and everybody else? When I was looking at who had to play who left, I looked at the ESPN bracketology that was released on February 4th, and the only teams that were actually in the tournament were Duke, Wake Forest, Miami, and North Carolina. The only team being a seed higher than 8 was Duke. Notre Dame wasn't even in it. They were part of the first 4 out. Florida State was in the next 4 out. So I easily see Duke winning this. Not even a competition. The only tournament teams they have yet left to play are Wake Forest and North Carolina. They have a few more of those notable teams that are in it, but more than anything else, I just think that is a reflection on how they have not been put down yet because they haven't played Duke yet. Like Virginia still has 2 games to go. Duke still has to go to the Carrier Dome up in Syracuse, and they're going to come out firing against Florida State. The other team, I just see the other 3 teams that staying at the top are Notre Dame, Wake Forest, and Miami for their second round buys. Miami's hardest game left is at Wake Forest. Wake Forest has to play all 3 of those teams in Duke, Notre Dame, and Miami. So I could see them potentially dipping down. I realistically don't know who I would say would rise up if that were the case. But at the end of the day, I think the guys underneath them will beat each other up. That Wake Forest will stay as the 4 in the conference. Will drop to the 4, but stay top 4. And then Notre Dame's only hard game really is Wake Forest. So I know I just said the same 4 teams like 10 times in a row. So good luck deciphering any of that. But yes, Duke winning it, Notre Dame, Miami, and Wake Forest getting buys.
I mean, as someone who hasn't gotten to watch a lot of college basketball this year, the way Duke's been talked about all season long, when I looked at the schedule and I saw Duke only had half a game lead in the ACC, I was relatively surprised because it's the way everybody makes it sound is they're running away with the conference right now. But with that being said, I also have to agree. I think Duke wins the conference,
especially because not to date the video, but the AP Top 25 for this week just recently came out. Duke is ranked 7th in the nation, and there isn't another ACC team to touch the ballot. It appears that Wake Forest got 21 votes and Notre Dame got 3 votes. But beyond that, not a single team from the ACC even made the top 25. So it is very interesting to see. And to close it out, our home conference, the Big Ten. This is also a loaded conference with a lot of teams left to potentially take it. Currently, Illinois has a 1-game lead after a really rocky start to their season, but has played great in Big Ten play. Behind them, Wisconsin and Purdue both trail by 1 game. Michigan State is behind by a game and a half. Ohio State is behind by 2. Indiana and Rutgers, with mediocre seasons, are both behind by 3. Michigan is behind by 4, and Iowa is behind by 4.5. I think that, you can just lop those last 2 teams off entirely. You don't really need to think about them, especially with how difficult Michigan's schedule is going to be. But because of the model we're using, I have to mention them. But just looking at some of the schedules left, I truly do think Purdue has the best chances of doing it, even though they're currently sitting 3rd. They have to play Illinois again, but they get to play them at home this time, and they already beat Illinois. So unless if Kofi Cockburn is going to take offense to that and really come out firing, I think Purdue will handle business there. I see Michigan State not really being able to match up with them. They play at Wisconsin, and Wisconsin isn't an easy place to play, but Johnny Davis has been struggling a little bit recently. The rest of their schedule is not the hardest, so they play some of the better teams once, but that's about it. The other teams I actually see getting second round buys are Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio State over Michigan State. Wisconsin, I actually was going to consider bumping them down, but they just have a little bit too easy of a schedule. They play at Michigan State versus Purdue. Those are the 2 big games. Yes, they have at Indiana, home and away against Rutgers, and home against Michigan, but realistically, whether if Johnny is dropping 40 in a night or, just a normal 15, I think the Badgers will take care of business as long as he doesn't have a 4-point game like he did against Penn State.
I mean, as I've learned from personal experience, sitting in the rack with the Badgers ranked number 1 in the nation, losing to Rutgers, the rack's one of those weird places. I mean, as we saw with Purdue earlier this season, you can't throw out a guaranteed win
No, but at the end of the day, I think that Michigan State schedule is way too difficult for them to be able to maintain that 4th spot in the conference. They have to play us again. Sorry, not us. They have to play Wisconsin again. They have to play Illinois again. They'll have Purdue coming into town, and they'll have to go to Ohio State. So they play all of the teams that I see as being the top 4 buys. So it's hard, even if they take 1 or 2 of those games, it's hard for me to truly believe that they'll be able to stay at the top.
I mean, I want to say Wisconsin wins the conference just as the homer pick, but I saw Purdue in person. I was shocked when the Badgers beat Purdue at Purdue earlier this season. And Johnny Davis did come out and say, or there were reports about Johnny Davis going to the gym last night after weight room to get him more work because he wants to get a little better at finding teammates when the defense claps down. The Badgers have struggled when Davis struggles to find players to step up, or when Davis is struggling. He's one of the best players in the nation. And he's carried a Badger team that wasn't supposed to be where they are right now, or they projected to finish 10th or 11th in the Big Ten.
Depending on who you ask, 9th or 10th. Yeah.
So it's amazing, Badger fans, that Wisconsin's sitting where they're sitting right now. Watch that Illinois game. We got to figure out how to defend against bigs like Kofi Coburn. But I mean, at the same time, there's not a lot of players that have the ability of Kofi, and just watching him down low, it's how does Illinois lose the game with a guy like that down low? Just throw it into the post.
You can do your best to force him to his right shoulder. But at the end of the day, if he really wants to go to his left shoulder, he's going to go to his left shoulder. So, I
mean, the dude looks like a man playing basketball against a bunch of high school kids. Just his size. God. So I'm not eliminating Illinois out, but like I said, with what I was able to see with Purdue in person with them, I want to say I think they blew out Creighton at the Crossroads Classic.
Butler,
sorry. Why did I say Creighton? That's in
Nebraska.
Yeah. Not even.
It's all good.
With how they played against Butler, just running them out of the gym, basically. And just me looking at the guys I was at the game with and saying, wow, that is a high-level team. I haven't seen the Badgers in person yet this season. I don't know if I'm going to get to see them in person unless it's in March or in the Big Ten tournament.
Hey, but you might get to see them at the Rack.
I'm away during that weekend.
You will not.
I'm in the Midwest that weekend.
Ironic.
But I just see Purdue as one of those dominant teams that once they get it going, it's going to be interesting to see what is it, the second to last or last game of the season at Wisconsin?
For Wisconsin, it is the second to last game. So it's going to be right there. It's in March, so it's going to be very interesting. Purdue still needs to learn how to play some defense a little bit better. That's the one area they are lacking. But if they can learn to defend just even a little bit better, this is going to be a team that's hard to start in March.
I do have to agree with you, though, that I think it's Illinois, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Ohio State. I don't know what seeding order is going to be, but those are my 4 projected buys for the Big Ten. In Ohio State, Wisconsin, at Ohio State a few months back.
Absolutely.
They're the
Yeah.
real deal.
So I just am going to throw my top 25 up here. Most of you guys can read it. There are only 3 really notable teams I really, really want to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about me ranking Arizona over Auburn. And that is not a poor reflection of Auburn. I get that a lot of people would say that I'm punishing them, but I'm not. It has nothing to do with Auburn's game against Missouri, nothing against their game against, nothing to do with their game against Georgia. It has everything to do with Arizona being able to beat UCLA, who I had second last week. I get that I also dropped UCLA really far, but a lot of that just had to do with other teams winning. So I do think that as it currently sits, if Auburn and Arizona played each other, Arizona would win. That being said, that could easily change in the matter of half a week. The only other team that I really, really wanted to talk about was Wyoming. Wyoming just had a massive, massive week in the Mountain West. They played 3 of the best teams and won every single game. They were able to beat Colorado State, Boise State, and Fresno State. So for me to know that they aren't currently ranked in the top 25 is absolutely ludicrous. I have them 18th. Even then, I think I might have been gypping them a little bit because of how highly I regard the Mountain West this year. But I just think that somebody needs to start giving them some more respect.
I love seeing schools like Wyoming and Boise State getting some respect. Give those non-power 5 conference, non-power 6 conferences some respect, baby.
You'll love the current AP top 25 because for the first time this season, St. Mary's cracked it and Murray State cracked it. So
love to hear it. I have buddy on Twitter who former long snapper, I think, goes to Murray State. So you love to see Murray State make it to the rankings. I see you guys. Guys, Andrew, you got anything else to add before we close this thing out? Guys, thank you so much for watching. We are enjoying making this podcast. Thank you for the viewership. Last week's video is the highest rated podcast, so we're going up. Granted, that might have been the title of signing day preview, but we'll see. We'll see. We got a lot planned over the next few months for this and for the channel in general. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and as always, remember to embrace the grind.
Oh, I don't want to minimize, damn it. Damn it.